We're up to the principle that you've all been waiting for. When do we punish children? Or do we? I think we probably don't. So let's talk in this session about natural and logical consequences, and about the use of timeout and any other mean things that you can think of that we do with children. I'm going to suggest, for the purpose of discussion, that when we care for very young children, there are two basic rules. One is you may not hurt yourself or anyone else, and the second is you may not destroy property, yours or anyone else's. That, to me, forms a kind of umbrella for what is important. What is important to enforce, to explain to children, and then what do we do if they don't pay any attention?
What about using the words can't and don't? Is
Yes.
that something that's acceptable?
Yes. Well, thank you. I would be using my quota here. To me, you can say to school-age children, we need to be kind to our friends, and that's a positive statement. I think if you say that to young children, or be nice, it doesn't have any meaning. So I would use a very strong don't with preschool children. Don't hurt people, and don't hurt yourself. Don't destroy property, and don't destroy anybody else's. What do you think about that? Are you with it or against it? It's okay? Okay. Then what happens if we set a rule that protects property or protects somebody's physical body, and children break the rule? Do we have any recourse? Well, let's talk about natural and logical consequences for a moment. And let me try to describe what I think is the difference between them. A natural consequence to an action is that what unfolds without interruption is somehow the result of the original action. So let's say that a child runs into the road and is hit by a car. That is a natural consequence. However, we don't allow that to happen. A child runs into the road, we interfere, and we institute what we call a logical consequence. And let's think of what some logical consequences might be for running into the road. It might be that the child cannot play in front of the house, must play inside, must play in the backyard, must play in a fenced-in area. So the message is, you are not safe when you run into the road, and I need to keep you safe, so you have to stay in a safe place. Now, if we take a slightly easier example, we find a, let's say a 3-year-old sitting in the corner tearing up a book, page by page by page. A natural consequence would be that he would eventually run out of books to tear up. We're not going to let that happen. So we have a logical consequence, which is, I'm sorry, we can't destroy property. I'm afraid you'll have to stay away from the books or play where there are no books for, what, with a 3-year-old, the rest of the morning, with a 5-year-old, all day today and all day tomorrow. So you adjust the consequence on the basis of the age of the child and what the natural consequence would be if you don't interfere with it. Does that make sense? And is that what we do? Now, those consequences are different than saying, you tore a book, go into timeout. Because timeout has nothing to do with what the child just did. So the consequence, when we're using them, always has to be related to the action. And it's as simple as that. So let's ask the group for some examples of behaviors for which we might have to institute a natural consequence. Sometimes a natural consequence can be allowed if, well, we said earlier, an 8-year-old chooses to go outside without mittens in the winter will have cold hands. That is a natural consequence. It's also perfectly logical. We would not do it with a child under the age of probably 5 or 6. Other examples?
With school age, I do think it becomes a little bit easier because they have the abstract thinking, so they can understand it. So what I'll say though is, I think where we fall short is the follow through. So I think we often give a lot of, well, if you do this, then this is going to happen. And then I'll hear, well, I told you if you do this, then this is going to happen. And so I think providers sometimes struggle with that, drawing that line in the sand and then actually following through. And I think that's where we get ourselves into trouble a little bit. Mm-hmm. So if you say, if you throw that ball up against a school again, then the ball becomes mine for the rest of the day. Mm-hmm. And they do that and you don't take it away, they've won. We've lost your power.
Absolutely.
Because you didn't follow through. And that's what I see when I'm in the field. I'll see a lot of those, well, I told you, but they know you don't mean business. So then they're going to continue to push that envelope.
Boy, I love the way you said that too, Lynn. You said, well, say it again. If you throw the ball up against the school
again,
it will become
mine. It will become mine for the rest of the day. For the rest of the day. And again, I think we have to be careful about that time span, to your point, about making it appropriate. And for school age, the rest of the day is, an hour and a half, 2 hours. It's not, you can never use that ball again.
Right.
It's, it's got to be a very, very, and I think what we can also do is to lay the consequence out with the action. So oftentimes when I'll walk into a program, if you do this, then this is going to happen. So the consequences are there ahead of time, and oftentimes in school age, they're creating those consequences themselves.
Okay.
So the ownership is off of you as a caregiver, and it falls more into the responsibility of the child, which again, as they're getting older, makes more sense.
Good point. Now, I did this workshop once with a bunch of parents, and the example that somebody gave was in a home situation, a 4-year-old kept leaving his tricycle in front of the garage. When his dad came home from work, his dad wanted to put the car in the garage and the tricycle was there. And a grandfather in the group said, just run over the tricycle. That's a logical consequence, a natural consequence, said he. Well, to me, that was much too severe. Not only was the child going to be penalized by not having a tricycle to ride, but the parent was going to have to buy a new trike eventually. It seemed to me it was expensive. So I think we need to be very careful about reasonableness. A spanking is never a natural or logical consequence. Doesn't matter if the child has hit somebody. A biting is never a natural or logical consequence. Child has bitten. We never bite the child to teach him not to bite, because what we're doing is to model, if you want to get away with biting, be sure you're bigger and stronger than the person you're biting. So all those kind of very punitive things that we used to do to children, we now try to change so that they see that behavior is logically related to what happens next, and they're in charge of their own behavior. Make sense? Yes, Anne.
And as you said, you have to look at the ages. And
Yes.
with us, with toddlers, you need to remember that they're learning. So we use the 1, 2, 3 approach, where let's say a child is climbing on the table, and we know that toddlers want to climb, but the table is not the place to climb. We would tell them that our feet belong on the floor here. If you need to climb, you need to go over to but they need to learn that the table is not the place to do it. If they do it again, we said, we talked about this. This is going to be the consequence if it happens again, and then if it happens a third time, we told you this was going to happen if you did it again, so now we can't play in this area. We're going to go someplace else.
Okay.
But it's consistently 1, 2, 3 with the toddler age, because they're learning.